My name is obviously Dr. Shannon Bossard, and I currently reside within ARN's NeuroLab. And so what I wanted to do today was talk to you about obviously measuring advertising effectiveness, obviously beyond attention. So I imagine that you guys have heard quite a lot about attention, both today but also outside, so externally. And so what I wanted to talk about was why brands need to consider going beyond attention. And so what I'll do is I'll talk about two main areas. I'll talk about how to measure and enhance advertising effectiveness, obviously using a multitude of metrics. And then I'll talk about how to best plan for effectiveness. So obviously, when I started this journey, I wanted to have a look at what the industry considered to be an effective ad. And so like any excellent marketer does, or any researcher does, I jumped onto Google. And I did a bit of a Google and tried to look at how the industry defined advertising effectiveness. And as you can imagine, there are hundreds of definitions, many, many rabbit holes to go down. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add to those rabbit holes. I'm going to add to the definitions. I'm going to add more clutter. So what we know from preliminary neuroscience data is that brands have to consider more than just attention. So attention is obviously a requirement for in terms of effective advertising, but there's a need to go beyond that. And so when we have a look at the types of ads, particularly within audio and TV, and we can discern how those ads are performing, particularly across these four metrics. So we have attention, engagement, memory encoding, and of course attitude. There's this, I guess, this expectation that once you've capitalized on high levels of attention, that you're guaranteed to, obviously enhance how the consumer responds across these other metrics. And what we're finding is that's not necessarily the case. So if we take the top 50 performing ads, and we've probably tested about 300 now, if we take the top 50 performing for attention, and we have a look at how many of those ads reappear as high performers of either engagement or memory, there's only about a 30% relationship, so a 30% overlap. And then when we get to the far side and we have a look at attitude, we see again there is a relationship between them, but it's minimal, right? So we see that about 3 of those 50 ads also score high from an attitude point of view. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to talk about, I guess, media effectiveness in terms of a funnel, because I think everybody kind of gets the idea of funnels and everybody likes funnels. And so what I wanted to do is obviously initially it's really important that you get the attention of the consumer. You have to be noticed, and I'll talk about that in more detail in terms of how I define being noticed. Then obviously there's this requirement that whatever you're presenting the consumer with, they encode it. It has to be stored into memory. And then finally, the way that or the manner in which you do both of those things should be positive. You want the consumer to associate your brand with positivity, because that's effectively how you grow things like loyalty, willingness to pay, and of course habitual purchasing or automatic purchasing. So attention, like I said, you guys are more than familiar with attention now. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to talk about what it means or how I define attention and why it's important. And attention is obviously important because, like you've already heard today, if you don't have attention, then you just don't exist. It's as simple as that. You have to have at least some level of attention in order for you to exist within the mind of the consumer. But I think everybody's kind of familiar with this idea that there's different types of attention, that it functions potentially on a spectrum, where at one end you have active levels of attention, and on the far left-hand side, you have passive levels of attention. I've obviously left no attention off this graph because the only way that you're receiving no attention at all is if the consumer isn't present or if you're not present. So at some point, regardless of how it operates, if you're present, then you're getting at least some level of attention. Now, depending on where you operate on this spectrum will determine the types of outcomes that you get. So I'll start on the right-hand side where you're able to capitalize active attention. I think there's this maybe misconception that active attention is number 1, a requirement, and number 2, that it serves the best purpose. But what we're seeing is that maybe that's not actually the case. So let me give you an example. Assuming that your goal is to get the consumer's active levels of attention, let's say you've just purchased an outdoor billboard, right? And on that billboard it says, let's just say you're a telco provider, and it says NBN unlimited $69.95 a month. Now, you've done the job of getting the attention of the consumer, but what you may have inadvertently done is promote that they go elsewhere and look. Because how do they know that that's a good proposition? And what this does is it may drive them elsewhere. So there are instances, and I think the panelists have already said that there's lots of things we don't know, but one of the things that we do know, or one of the things we think we know, is that there are certain cases where active attention will work more sufficiently. So if you are a brand looking to break into a market, then you probably require the consumer knowing that you exist consciously. And so for that reason, active attention is probably better. Now on the far left-hand side of the spectrum, you have passive levels of attention. And I think in the discussions that we have, sometimes passive attention is kind of neglected a little bit. But there are use cases for this as well. And so if you already exist within a market and you don't necessarily want to have the, suffer the consequences of potentially driving consumers elsewhere, then there is an argument to be made that maybe you should be capitalizing on passive levels of attention. So just being present without necessarily having the consumer know that you're there. And so there's a few really great examples of how passive attention can drive behavior. One of the most and probably oversighted references is that of French and German wines in a liquor store. So some researchers had a display in the store that had French and German wines on it. And then on alternating days, they would play French and German music. And so what happened was on the days where they were playing German music, German wines outsold French wines 3-1. And when they played French music, the inverse was true. So French wines outsold German wines 3-1. And afterwards, after their purchases, they asked the consumers, what influenced your purchase behavior? Only one participant said it was the music. So again, there is this spectrum, and depending on where you operate within that spectrum, you'll probably get different results. But attention isn't obviously a requirement. I did press the button. Large brands have known this for a while. Who here is unfamiliar with something like this? I'm sure that everybody's seen an electricity bill at some point. You all look like adults. Now with these energy bills, there's, I think these large companies have known that if they're going to send it out to you weekly, right, every time you get the bill, they're drawing attention to the fact that they exist, and they're drawing attention to the fact that you're paying that bill. And so there is this need to communicate with the consumer in some instances as little as possible. And so this is just one of those cases. So I would define attention as a sometimes metric, particularly active attention as a sometimes metric. If we're building a creative or if we're building a campaign, there are going to be instances where it's a requirement, but not necessarily all the time, particularly in the case of active attention. We've seen that as attention goes up, attitude goes down, right? And this probably lends itself to the fact that we as marketers, we as advertisers know that the best way to get attention is to be disruptive, right? So shove something in the consumer's face, they probably don't want it there. That's why they're heading for that cross button almost immediately. But this is the kind of results you get. So I think over the next couple of months, we'll see that there's this huge influx of discussion about the impact that context has. So, delivering those ads inside of content where the consumer actually finds it appealing. And I'll talk about attitude a little bit later, but attitude is fundamentally important when it comes to building media effectiveness, advertising effectiveness, and obviously consumer relationships. Now, one of the things that I wanted you guys to leave here with today is this understanding that, and again, you've heard it from some of the other panelists, that where you place your ad will determine the type of attention or the type of outcome that you get. And within some reason, within reason, you can modify the levels of attention or the levels of memory encoding that you're getting, but it is quite heavily determined by the platform itself. And so what I've done is I've taken the exact same ad that was actually a TVC, and I've removed the visuals. And so in pink, you can see the audio only, and in blue, you can see the combination, so you can see the original format. And when we have a look at what drives attention, so basically you're looking for peaks in that data. So every time there's like a high inflection, right, you see high levels of attention. And when we, I pressed it twice. When we overlay the portions of that creative or the portions of that ad where we see high levels of attention from an audio perspective only, you can see that it's very much about the verbal. It's about the message that you're trying to deliver. So it's almost like informative. It's like when the actors are speaking, or when they're talking about their brand message, or when the sonic trigger is available. And you can see what's really interesting is that those peaks don't exist within the original format. So again, where you place your ad will determine how you communicate, how you get that level of attention. If we have a look at the same version, so this is, I've obviously overlaid some of the images, what we find is that if you're looking to drive attention within the campaign, audio visual does a particularly good job of demonstrating how consumers are interacting with the brand, demonstrating how the product actually looks. And so there's this argument to be made that potentially, and this isn't obviously in every case, but that if you're building a campaign that you would use something like TV to demonstrate how consumers are consuming that content or how they should interact with that particular product or how they should feel emotionally towards that product. And then you would use audio to kind of upweight that campaign by allowing you to communicate what is probably more informational. So there's this difference between a demonstrative platform and an informational platform. But there is nonetheless this desire or this need to obviously utilize multiple platforms. But beyond attention, so attention is obviously a requirement, but beyond attention, with what I think not only within a commercial space, but also within an academic space, there is this acknowledgement that memories are really strong drivers of consumer behavior. Memories are what influence quite heavily consumer behavior or purchase behavior. And one of the best examples of that is Coca-Cola. Who here is familiar with New Coke? A couple? Yeah? Who actually tasted New Coke? Yeah, basically none, because it was a massive failure. So back in the 80s, and I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but back in the 80s, Coca-Cola or Pepsi had just come to market with this Pepsi challenge, which is still around. You basically take 2 cups to your friends, one's filled with Coke, one's filled with Pepsi, and you ask them, which one do you prefer? More often than not, people will pick Pepsi. Okay, and so as a result of this having gone out to market, Coke actually had started losing quite a bit of market share. And in order to combat that, they did this hugely expensive piece of market research where they asked about 250,000 people to do taste tests and all sorts of things. And they arrived at the conclusion that they had to release New Coke. And New Coke beat Pepsi on virtually every metric. Afterwards, they had about 45,000 complaints. They had people protesting, people like stockpiling most of the old stock. And I think the exercise cost them somewhere in the vicinity of $30 million. So it was a fairly expensive exercise. And it wasn't until about 20 years later that some guys in a lab basically replicated this piece of research, but they looked at how the brain responded. And what they found was that in blind taste tests, so when people didn't know what they were consuming, that certain areas of the brain lit up that didn't light up when Coke was present. So Coke, when we have a look at the areas and the difference in terms of function of those areas, the areas that lit up when people were drinking Coke when they knew that it was Coke were more associated with really strong memories, social decisions, emotions, rather than simply things like learning, right? And so there was this distinction between how the brain reacted to this content when people knew that Coca-Cola was present. And so it's a really good demonstration that memories are a fundamental underpinning in terms of how we engage, how we purchase brands, or how we interact with brands. One of the best ways, and I think that as the industry decides to pursue metrics like attention, like memory, and I think people have already discussed it today, where you have a 30-second creative or a 60-second creative, and the last 2 seconds is where your brand is present, there's going to be this need to be more present. There's going to be this need to be omnipresent. And audio allows you to do that pretty successfully. So think of brand anthems. So Officeworks, Baker's Delight, McDonald's, has a bit of a jingle. But think about these ads where they can almost utilize the entire 30-second spot. So even if the consumer is not actively attending to the material, you're still getting cut through, and you're getting cut through that is brand specific. And that's really, really important because your brand is effectively present for the entire duration of that ad. And so what we find in the lab is that if we compare ads where a brand anthem is present with those where no audio is present or no music is present, we see that the brain allocates about 15% more resources to encoding that information into memory than it would when there is no music. So what I've done here is I've actually got some examples. So I wanted to engage you guys. I know that this was the last session of the day, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play some audio that belongs to brands, but I've removed the brand names. And then after I've played them, I want you to tell me who they belong to. Some of them I don't think have played for probably 25 years. My dad picks the fruit that goes to make the cordial that I like best. So that was obviously Coddies. I heard people say Coddies. When was the last time anybody heard that ad outside of this room, like on TV or in the media? Primary school, okay? I've got another one, slightly more difficult, I think.
13, 30, 32.
For everything mechanical, we've got it.
They'll fix the car.
We'll come to you. 13, 30, 32.
That's 13, 30, 32.
Who's that? Lumobile? If you don't know the name, you'll remember the kid with the mullet. I got another one.
131166. 131166. 131166.
Beautiful. All right, so you guys obviously work in media. So the last one that I've got goes for less than half a second, but I still think you can get it.
I like
Beautiful. It was aeroplane jelly. So again, it's this. I guess this was again just to demonstrate the power of audio, but also the power of memory encoding. So once you have those brand elements that are deeply encoded within the consumer, they're really hard to get out. And so beyond attention and beyond memory encoding, the way that you communicate with your audience has to be done in a positive way. Consumers are very, very much driven by their attitudes. And research, both in commercial spaces but also in academic spaces, has shown that attitude is heavily correlated with things like brand loyalty, willingness to pay, and of course, automatic or habitual purchases. And I think I may not have defined habitual purchases in great detail, but the end goal of advertising should be to have the consumer pick up your product or buy your product without necessarily giving it much thought. Right? That's kind of how Apple has become so big, is that consumers just kind of almost cult-like purchasing of this particular product. And so this stems from a lot of research, evolutionary research, that shows that we tend to avoid doing things we dislike. So who here takes 3 days of leave and comes back to like 150 emails? Yeah, most of you procrastinate, I imagine, because you just don't want to do it. But then the inverse of that is true also. We tend to pursue things that we like. So when we have a look at fast food, consumers don't necessarily want to consume that fast food, but it's really hard because the brain makes you do it anyway. And so again, the implication of that is that within consumer context, it's very much the same. So consumers are largely, their purchases are driven by what they like. So most people in the room either own an Apple or an Android or an iPhone. Who here purchased their iPhone because they don't like Apple? It's kind of a stupid question, but everybody purchases the products because they like or they have some kind of association with that particular product. When we have a look at how the brain responds, it's not just a matter of consciously thinking that you perceive these brands to be different, but your brain actually processes these brands as very different. So if we take consumers and we have them rate brands that they like on a scale of an arbitrary scale of 0 to 9, let's say, and then we take all of those brands that they rate really highly, all of the brands that they rate quite low, and then those brands that sit in the middle, we can see that the brain actually differentiates how it stores that information. So you can see at the top, you've got the brands that are liked. In the middle, you've got the brands that are disliked. And at the bottom, you have neutral brands. Now, what's really interesting about this is that there's this clear distinction between liked and the bottom two. But what's also interesting is that disliked brands and neutral brands are perceived fairly similarly. Now, don't worry, it's not all lost. If you're a brand that's either disliked or neutral, there's still hope. The research shows that if you repeatedly pair your product with, in this case, a positive piece of audio this was done with, what you find is that after about 5 repetitions or 5 pairings of your negative or neutral brand and something positive, you start to see change. So the brain starts to store that information differently. Now, if you have a liked brand, it takes about 16 exposures before you can start to get people to hate it, right? It's like before you see really any type of movement. And so the implications of this for marketing is that, I think we're all sometimes we can be very afraid in terms of changing a creative, or not necessarily changing the entirety of a creative, but having something new, right? Because, if it fails, then you have this you kind of have to go and talk to your CEO or your manager, or, why things didn't perform as well as they should have. And so everybody's so afraid to make changes. But what we're seeing is that if you have a really well-established brand, a brand that is well-liked, you can afford to be, more frugal in terms of the types of advertising that you do. So the last thing that I really wanted to talk about, and I don't know how much time I've got left, but the last thing I wanted to talk about is that how well you plan, how well you decide what your brand's objectives are, will determine the type of planning that you should be doing in terms of its effectiveness, right? So we've already discussed that there are multiple ways of measuring advertising effectiveness. It's not just reliant on a single metric. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to understand how different platforms lend themselves to some of these different metrics. And so what I've done is I've kind of put together a bit of a table where I've indexed all of the results. So we've obviously tested a number of ads belonging to each of these formats, and we start to see a few patterns arise. So if your goal is to drive things like high levels of attention, then radio does that particularly well. Unfortunately, we haven't tested any like online or digital or outdoor, so we're missing the visual component of this. But when we have a look at radio ads, what we see is that radio ads are quite good at driving high levels of attention, but they're also they also function pretty well in terms of both memory encoding and auditory attention, as one would expect. Now, in addition to this, what we see is that not only does radio have its own, I suppose, unique touch points, but it's also quite differentiated from both podcasting and TV, which funnily enough function fairly similarly. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer why I think these things happen, but I just don't know in terms of time how much longer I've got. But there is this distinction between both radio ads and podcasting and TV. And I think that's really, really interesting. When we talk about why some of these things happen at a top level, the way that we consume this media is obviously very different. So from a radio perspective, you're driven to pay attention. There's not all that much else going on other than the audio. So you kind of really don't have much else to process. When take TV, for instance, you're presented with visuals, you're presented with audio, and that's not to say that it's a bad medium by any means, but it means that you're presenting the consumer with multiple pieces of information. And what we've learned both within commercial settings and in academic settings is that when you give the brain too much to focus on, it will tend to focus on either one of them or none of them. And in this case, what we see is that it tends to focus on the emotional aspects, right? And so we saw that kind of in that ad that I broke down earlier, is that when the consumer, when the actors in those ads are, eliciting like an emotional response or their faces are present, these are the types of things that get uplift in the TV, and as a result, you're probably not paying as much attention to the audio pieces that are coming through. But that's basically it. So I think that there are three things that you should take away from today's, this short presentation. Obviously, that advertising effectiveness requires that consumers, or requires that you as brands or you as agencies or whoever go beyond that of just attention. Attention is one of many metrics that we can test, and I think that in order to fully understand what the consumer is doing and how they're interacting with brands, we need to go beyond that. The second thing is that memory encoding and attitudes are arguably or likely, stronger drivers of things like purchase intent. We're driven by the things we remember. We're driven by our previous interactions with brands. We're driven by primarily our attitudes towards those brands. And then finally, advertising effectiveness is channel dependent. So depending on where you place your ads, you're going to see different outcomes. And I think there is a need for media planners or media buyers to understand where the strengths of each channel lie and then capitalize on them accordingly. That's it. Does anybody have any questions?
There is one slide in relation to, oh, here we are, there's two. So both on attitudes actually, one in around, tell us a bit more about the attitudes measured with neuroscience techniques.
Mm-hmm. So what we do, generally speaking, is when we look to measure how the brain responds, what we do is we look at the areas that are responsible for certain tasks. So there are large areas of the brain dedicated to the processing of vision, for instance. And so if if a consumer is looking at something, then you would expect that those areas are more active than they are if they have their eyes closed, for argument's sake. There are areas associated with memory encoding and like and dislike. In terms of attitude specifically, we tend to measure motivation. So we are motivated to engage with things we like, and we are equally motivated to avoid things we don't like. And so we can measure how motivated the consumer is. And fortunately for neuroscience, we can have a look at the affect. So we can have a look at whether it's positive or negative. So we can have a look at whether they are in an approach state or a withdrawn state.
Okay, one more's just popped in. How do you control lab environment versus natural environment exposure?
It's a really good question. It's a question that, had we have solved already, there would probably be no university labs. It's a really great question. It's still my opinion. I imagine that most of you guys are still running surveys in some manner to collect some of your data. I would argue that having a lab setting is still better than asking people questions. We can't obviously exclusive. Like we can't 100% account for a lab, and so that's why we function in a lab. You can take the equipment out, but then you just end up having so many variables that you just can't account for the kind of findings that you get in the data. So we kind of have to have that lab setting. Yeah, I don't really know how to answer the question. That's just the nature of the research, unfortunately.
All right. Save it for Bob. So the one that I had, and I was just looking for the SCA guys because maybe they'd have answer, is with the podcast results. Is there a difference between the person running the podcast delivering the message versus a message interrupting content?
So preliminary data suggests that there is a preference of the consumer to listen to an ad that's actually played or spoken by the actual podcast host, but it's still in its early stages. Yeah, from both an attention point of view and an attitude point of view, it seems to be preferential to have a podcast host read the ads.
Brilliant.
Wonderful. Thank you.